So if anyone has anything better to do with their life than listen to a Canon lawyer, I strongly recommend it. Also, the presentation, again, my name is John Paul Kimes. I teach here in the law school. I'm a Canon lawyer. I'm not a real lawyer. I just play one in the church courts. And property is not my expertise, which is why this is Canon Law Property 101. So this is a very basic presentation. Just, again, some overviews of how the Catholic Church structures its own legal understanding of its properties, and then a couple of examples of how those structures sort of lead to questions about the application of canon law to property issues. So just sort of historically, the church gets into the property game fairly early on, so the church becomes legal in the year 313 with the Edict of Milan, and by the year 380, it becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And from there, we really start to appropriate property. Now, granted, we didn't appropriate all this. Please don't. We like land, but we don't own this much of it, I'm sorry to say. So just again, a general understanding, the structure that the church adopts over time mimics many elements of the structure of the Roman Empire. So even our basic language of talking about a diocese, or if you're an Eastern church, talking about an eparchy. Dioceses and eparchie are just two Greek terms that mean the same thing. It's territory. It's a territory that's a division that's used in the Roman Empire at different times and in different places to distinguish, again, turf, if you will. So we adopt this language very early on, and then we begin to develop it and sort of imbue it with a Christian ethos rather than just sort of the typical Roman understanding. Already, so again, by the time we get to the Codex Justiniani, so we're in the 6th century, we have a long history of codification, sort of legalization of the ownership of property in the church. And equally important is the right of every individual to bequeath property to the church. And you'll also see in the Codex Justiniani, there's also a prohibition on alienation, so that once the church is bequeathed to property, because that property inherited a sacred character, it was illegal to then sell the property. So there was an understanding the church was receptive of property. It could be receptive of gifts, but it had a harder time under Roman law or sort of imperial law to then go on and to sort of dispense with those properties. We don't need to look at this too much. So as we, again, because we're on the clock and we've already set an auctioneer's pace, so we'll zoom up to we'll fast forward to the year 800. We get to the Holy Roman Empire and Christendom, the idea of Christendom itself. So this intertwining of secular authority and religious authority, this begins to influence the way the church understands its own property. Along with the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, there's also the rediscovery of law, and really the discovery of law as a scientific study, so the law as an intellectual art. And in this, we bring in the Codex Justiniani, so we go back into Roman law, and then we begin to re-examine these things and apply them in a modern context. This all goes fairly well for the church as far as owning property, managing property. It all goes fairly well until the rise of the nation state, and then we now have a competing actor when it comes to property rights. So the church isn't the only show in town any longer. The state now also has property rights. And how is the modern state going to interact with what Roman law had established, Roman imperial law had established, saying church properties can't be taxed, the church can't alienate its own property, it can't sell its own property, but it's sort of the church is the universal receiver, not a universal donor when it comes to property. So again, you move up to the 1917 when the church, for the first time, takes its own laws and creates a code. So before this time, it's not that we didn't have law, it's just it was in a different form. So if you go to 1917 and you look in the code and you go to Canon 1495, you find the church's expression of its ability to own and manage property. Not merely to own and receive property, but to receive, to own, and to manage property. And it refers to this right as being native. It is an inherent right of the church. It is a native right. It's inherent in the church that it can freely and independently of civil authority. An incredibly bold claim that I will not suggest to you is entirely true, but it is an incredibly bold claim that we can independently, through this native right, So independent and free from civil powers, we can acquire, retain, and administer, again, what the church calls temporal goods. So and what the most important thing to understand with church and property is that physical property, whether it's a building, like all property, all stuff in the church is stuff. And it's stuff that is useful for the preaching of the gospel. And therefore it is called a temporal good. So it doesn't matter whether it's cash, it doesn't matter whether it's stocks or land or buildings. We don't care. It's stuff. And the technical term for that stuff are temporal goods. Now, in the 1917 code, it only lists 3 different activities. So every activity with managing this temporal stuff, fell into the category either of acquiring, retaining, or administering. So this notion of administration obviously is where most of the action actually took place. And in this, the church used a term distinguishing between physical persons and moral persons, so that you were either a physical person or you were a non-human being that was a juridic entity. And the term for this juridic entity was moral person. Well, when we get to the 1983 code, we redo this, we reorganize more or less all of our property talk, all of our stuff talk, and we call it's now Book 5. So the code is divided, if you're in the Latin code, the code is divided into 7 books as opposed to 6, which it used to be, and temporal goods is now 5 instead of 4 where it used to be. So the temporal goods of the church are now administered in Book 5, which is super skinny. Super, super skinny. Lots of stuff in there, but there are not a lot of laws. And again, they're organized around this notion of temporal goods. So again, just think of stuff that can be owned in the world that can facilitate the preaching of the gospel. So money, land, buildings, all of these kinds of things together. But it refers to the church. But which church? Is it the parish? Is it the diocese? Is it the universal church? Do we want to get super theological, and do we want to distinguish the Church of Jesus Christ from its presence in the Catholic Church? Like, what is this church? And so we try to find a different answer. We're like, okay, the Catholic Church. So this Catholic Church has, again, still the innate right. So it's still jus nativum, so the same phrase, just translated into English as the innate right to do what? Well, now we've sort of upped the game. We've gone from 3 categories to 4. So we can now acquire, retain, administer, and alienate. So the concept of alienation of property is the great novelty of the 1983 code, because it's now seen as something distinct from ordinary administration. So we're going to introduce 2 new categories. So first is alienation, which just put a pin in alienation for now, and now we're going to distinguish administration in 2 different ways. So we're going to have ordinary administration and extraordinary administration, and that's where, like, it's in the land of extraordinary information where everything goes, where the train goes off the rails and then runs into the dumpster fire, and then everything comes tumbling down when we get into questions of extraordinary administration. And all of this again is made by the extraordinarily bold, parenthetically, not entirely true claim of it being independent from civil power. Why is this not an entirely true claim? Because the church says immediately in Book 5, we don't do contracts. We don't do contracts. Wherever you are in the world, you do their contracts. We are not getting in the contract business. Well, how do you hold that you can do all of this independent from civil authority, and yet at the same time say every time you have to enter into a contract to buy a property, to sell a property, to receive a property, whatever, I have to use a contract from that country? There's a little bit of tension there if we're honest with ourselves, and that's fine. You can still have this innate right. This innate right can still be part of ecclesiastical liberty, which is a tremendous concept in the life of the church. But it can also then at the same time hold this tension and say, why doesn't the church get into contract law? Well, imagine for yourself a truly global organization that is present in every jurisdiction across the world, and it says, here's the only way we do contracts. So you 187 or 193 countries in the world, if you're going to have a contract that's entered into in the Catholic Church in your property, in your state, this is the way we're going to do it. that's an even bolder claim that the church was not willing to make wisely. So if there's a contract, the church is going to use the contracts, again, in the place, but then they're going to be separate conditions, some conditions placed on the contract. So again, we go from acquire, retain, and administering property to acquire, retaining, administered, and alienating property. Alienation is an important concept because when most people in the church think about alienation, they think about one thing: selling. Alienation, particularly in an American mindset, for whatever reason, alienation means to sell, which is not what alienation means in Latin. Alienation means to transfer ownership, which is different than selling, because there are other ways of transferring ownership than selling. So again, just the way we think about what these words actually mean is very important to how we understand how they work in the church. So who can own property? So we said the Catholic Church has this native right. What parts of the Catholic Church can actually own property? So the Universal Church, somebody figure out who's going to sign that deed. The Apostolic See, okay, this is very clear. So the Pope is going to enter into a contract to own the property. Particular churches, what does the phrase particular church mean in the 1983 code? It means a diocese. And then what's going to raise another problem. So how does this ecclesial entity of organization then come into own property? And then other juridic persons, either public or private. And here's the key phrase: juridic persons. So in the 1917 code, we use the expression physical persons and moral persons. Well, now the only place we talk about a moral person is the Apostolic See. So the only moral person that still exists in the 1983 code is the Apostolic See. Everything else has become a juridic person, which just is better language, for lack of, it doesn't change the reality. What is a juridic person that a moral person wasn't? It's the same thing. It's just a non-human being that is an entity, a recognized entity, organized entity in the life of the church. So they can either be public or private, and they are all subjects capable of doing these four things with property. Canon 1256 then gives us a principle that under the supreme authority of the Roman pontiff, the ownership of goods belongs to that juridic person which has acquired them legitimately. So again, similar to the principles in civil law, we need to know whose name is on the deed. We need to know what the juridic person is that has acquired this property over time. And it's, for most places, at least in the American context, well, I shouldn't say, it used to be the case that everybody used corporation sole, so it was the diocese that was sort of the title holder to all of the properties, and then we ran into torts, and then we decided that this was probably not a good idea anymore because it made us liable to over $3 billion in settlements for a little thing we had called sex abuse, and so now we use different civil structures, but the problem then becomes making those civil structures align with the church's understanding that ultimately this property is owned by a juridic person. So how do we blend different civil structures into the church's own understanding? And the most common way this is done now is through trust, but that's somebody else's job, not mine. We'll just set that aside. Know that it has to belong to a juridic person unless it's owned physically. So physical persons are us, juridic persons are anything else, and the definition technically is they are subjects in canon law of obligations and rights which correspond to their nature. Now, if that meant anything to you, you were someone other than Professor Sambray, who's sitting here in the room. This is my second teaching evaluation in the day, mind you. So this is, there's a lot of pressure up here today, so I apologize. So what does this definition actually mean? You're subjects in canon law that are, you're subject of obligation and rights which correspond to your nature. It basically means that you are how you are designed to be. So all of these things, what is a juridic person? Juridic person is whatever entity exists within the life of the church that is defined in a particular way that does not contradict canon law. So can a school be a juridic person? Sure. Can a parish be a juridic person? Of course. The diocese itself is a juridic person that has certain rights and obligations which correspond to its nature. What's the nature of a diocese? According to canon law, it is a portion of the people of God. So its rights and obligations correspond to its nature as a portion of the people of God. So These juridic persons, again, just to dive down in the definition so you can't say I didn't do my work, they are aggregates of persons or things ordered for a purpose which is in keeping with the mission of the church, which transcends the purpose of the individual. So a juridic person is an aggregate. So that's, again, another piece, that it's a collective. So it's a collective that transcends the identity of an individual to do something that furthers the mission of the church. So why do we have juridic persons? We do this to further the mission of the church. And again, how do we do that? So the most common way this is done in the life of the church is either through ordinary administration or extraordinary administration of this stuff, of these temporal goods that we have. If it's ordinary, here's where things begin. Here's where the mechanisms begin to work in canon law. So ordinary administration as opposed to extraordinary administration. What is the difference? What are the constitutive elements that are the difference? And unfortunately, it's a combination of things. So it's both the value of the transaction and the kind of transaction. Those two things together distinguish an ordinary act of administration, I'm paying my parish's monthly electric bill, from an extraordinary act of administration, I'm buying a new cathedral for the Diocese of Orange, it's going to cost me $132 million. So it's both the cost and the kind of transaction together that distinguish between an ordinary act of administration and extraordinary act of administration. Legally, in the life of the church, what's the difference? What's the difference is what level of response you need from the appropriate authorities. So if the bishop wants to engage in an ordinary act of administration, all he has to do is hear the finance council. Literally, I have to listen to you. Not listen to you in the sense of do what you tell me to do. I have to physically hear the words that are coming out of your mouth, and then I am going to go take care of my ordinary administration. As opposed to extraordinary administration where I need your consent. I need consent both of the finance council and of the College of Consultors. So these two separate entities within a diocese are going to have to combine to give me their consent when I need this extraordinary act of administration, which again is both the type of operation and the cost of operation. So again, in the U.S., this is left up to the Episcopal Conference. So each Episcopal Conference has a responsibility to define what is ordinary versus extraordinary. So our bishops have decided that these things here constitute extraordinary acts. So you'll notice financial settlements, so tort settlements, claims like that are extraordinary acts. Issuing bonds, taking on mortgages, bank debt in the excess of the minimum amount set in accord with Canon 1292, paragraph 1. Another huge banner. What does this mean? It means the church understands that she operates in different parts of the world where money has different value. So in the U.S., there's a two-tier system, and that two-tier system, the two-tier system here is $1 million for dioceses with more than 500,000 Catholics, $500,000 for dioceses with fewer than 500,000 Catholics, or the larger of 25,000 or 5% of the prior year's annual income for juridic persons subordinate to the diocese. So there's a mathematical formula that's been generated by the Bishops' Conference that corresponds to the limit of Canon 1292. That's where we set the line again. So the maximum amount is $10 million for dioceses with more than 500,000 Catholics, $5 million for dioceses with fewer than 500,000 Catholics. So how much money you're going to spend depends on how many Catholics you actually have. And what happens when you hit that limit? You go to Rome. So you get consent from your local authorities, from the financial board, you get consent from the College of Consultors, and then you have to go argue your case in Rome. So again, for us, it's $10 million for larger dioceses, $5 million for smaller dioceses. Is this an unfair burden? You can ask yourself. So that a diocese in rural Kansas is going to sell land that if it were the same property were found in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, its value would be 100-fold. I mean, the cathedral of my diocese is located on a postage stamp. Well, that postage stamp happens to be in Beverly Hills, California. So it has earthquake insurance of over $100 million. It's smaller than the parking lot of the parish that I grew up in Birmingham, the entire complex of which is valued at $5 million. So there's a question here about fairness and burden that these limits provide. One quick example of how things can get complicated before DJ totally cuts me off. One quick example, so local example, Holy Cross College sold its land, or part of its land, to the University of Notre Dame, half of its land, so 75 acres, to the University of Notre Dame a couple years ago for cash, because it needed cash. Well, both of these entities are owned by the same religious community, the Congregation of Holy Cross. But these two entities are separate juridic persons. So while to an American who's not versed in church law, we're like, well, why is the Congregation of Holy Cross selling itself a piece of property? It's because both of these pieces of property have separate juridic personalities in the life of the church, and therefore it's a transaction, and because the transaction is over the limit, it actually has to be approved by Rome. So even though things can seem to be very simple on the surface, they get very difficult in a hurry. There are regulations for sordid use, grave use, all of these kinds of things, and the poor parish of St. Cunegunda can wait for another day. So thank you.